Candlelight flickered against the cascading crystal chandeliers of Lord Castlereagh's dining room, casting long, wavering shadows that concealed Mayfair's darkest secrets far better than any velvet curtain. In a society obsessed with pedigree, pristine reputations, and loud declarations of inherited wealth, the most dangerous weapon a woman could wield was absolute silence. Brianna Fairfax possessed exactly that. She was a ghost clad in faded silk, entirely unnoticed by the glittering, predatory ton, until a single, clumsy accident shattered the quietude of a sprawling, 50-course banquet. It was a remarkably minor transgression, yet it captured the piercing, cynical gaze of Arraston Street John, Duke of Ashbourne. Exactly 3 weeks later, against all reason and societal mandate, he bound her to him in matrimony. Silence was a survival tactic for Brianna Fairfax. While other debutantes of the 1814 London season draped themselves in imported French lace and practically threw themselves into the paths of eligible bachelors, Brianna cultivated the art of blending into the wallpaper. She was the eldest daughter of Baron Fairfax, a man whose gambling addictions had systematically stripped his family of their fortune, their lands in Surrey, and finally, their dignity. Tonight, the social battleground was the grand dining room of Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh. The occasion was ostensibly to celebrate the arrival of Tsar Alexander to London, but in reality, it was a high-stakes auction block for the unmarried daughters of the aristocracy. Brianna was only invited out of a lingering, pitying obligation to her late mother's memory. She sat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, her gown a remarkably clever reworking of a dress 5 seasons out of date. The faded lavender silk was strategically draped to hide the frayed hems, and Brianna kept her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed firmly on her porcelain plate. She preferred the invisibility. Being seen meant being scrutinized, and scrutiny would reveal the desperate truth. Her family was mere weeks away from debtor's prison. Her younger sister, Clara, who suffered from a weak lung and required constant medical attention, would not survive a winter in the Fleet. Therefore, Brianna attended these agonizing dinners to slip pastries into her reticule for her sister and to avoid the notice of their father's most ruthless creditor, a shadow broker named Silas Rutledge. At the absolute center of the table, radiating an aura of bored hostility, sat Arraston Street John, the Duke of Ashbourne. He was arguably the most powerful peer in the room, possessing wealth that rivaled the crown and a reputation that bordered on the scandalous. Arraston was 32. Sharply handsome with aristocratic cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter storm. He was also notoriously unforgiving. He had spent the last 5 years dodging the matrimonial traps set by ambitious mothers, finding the entire charade of the season utterly repulsive. To his right sat Lady Genevieve Rutherford, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her venom. She was the favored candidate for the role of Duchess of Ashbourne, and she spent the first 3 courses leaning precariously close to Arraston, whispering malicious gossip about the other attendees. "Look at the Farthingale girl," Genevieve murmured, sipping her wine, "wearing emeralds with that complexion. It is a tragedy. And over there, practically hiding behind the candelabra, the Fairfax girl. I am astounded she has the audacity to show her face. Everyone knows her father lost the last of their estate to Beau Brummel at White's last Tuesday." Arraston did not look at the Farthingale girl, but Genevieve's malicious tone regarding the Fairfax girl caught his attention. He shifted his gaze down the long expanse of the table, past the silver Eponus groaning with exotic fruits, and found the woman in question. Brianna was attempting to quietly slice a piece of roasted pheasant. She looked small, almost fragile, but there was a rigid tension in her posture that spoke of immense, contained stress. She was not conventionally dazzling. Her hair was a dark, ordinary brown pulled back severely, and her skin lacked the fashionable porcelain pallor, hinting at too much time spent walking rather than riding in a carriage. It was in that precise moment that the footman, navigating the tight space behind Brianna's chair with a heavy silver platter of asparagus in hollandaise sauce, stumbled. The platter tipped. Brianna, moving with startling reflexes, twisted in her chair to avoid the scalding sauce. In doing so, her elbow struck her crystal wine goblet. It shattered against the mahogany with a sound like a pistol shot. The loud conversation in the room abruptly died. 50 pairs of eyes swiveled toward the dark corner of the table. Brianna froze, the color draining entirely from her face. The silence was absolute, heavy with the collective judgment of the ton. "My deepest apologies, my lord," Brianna whispered, her voice barely carrying, though her eyes remained downcast as she addressed the host. She did not burst into tears. She did not feign a swoon. She simply reached out with a steady, white-knuckled hand and began to gather the shards of broken glass herself, a massive breach of etiquette. "Leave it, Miss Fairfax," Castlereagh said, his tone dismissive and irritated. The servants will manage." The incident was over in seconds. The conversation resumed, the volume returning to its previous deafening roar. Genevieve laughed softly. How utterly humiliating. She has no breeding whatsoever. Ariston did not laugh. He watched Brianna Fairfax. He noted the way her hands trembled slightly as she placed them back in her lap, and he noted the way she surreptitiously slipped a clean, uneaten bread roll into a hidden pocket of her gown. She was not a clumsy debutante looking for attention. She was a woman fighting a silent, desperate war. For the first time in a decade, the Duke of Ashbourne was genuinely intrigued. The invisible girl had materialized, and Ariston resolved to uncover exactly what she was hiding. The morning after the Castlereagh dinner, the gossip columns of the Morning Post were ablaze with commentary on the Duke of Ashbourne's brooding demeanor, but entirely silent on the shattered glass of Miss Brianna Fairfax. She had successfully faded back into the margins of society. Brianna spent her morning in the damp, freezing kitchen of their rented, crumbling townhouse in Bloomsbury, boiling a thin broth for Clara. Her father was absent, presumably sleeping off a stupor in some opium den in Covent Garden. Every shadow in the house seemed to mock her, reminding her of the looming deadline. Silas Rutledge had given her father until the end of the month to repay £3,000. If the debt remained unpaid, Rutledge had promised to take alternative payment. He had looked at Brianna when he said it, his eyes lingering with a foul, possessive gleam. She had 2 weeks left. When the invitation arrived that afternoon, delivered by a footman in crimson and gold livery, Brianna stared at it as if it were a venomous serpent. It was an invitation to the Duchess of Richmond's ball, the most exclusive event of the season. The Fairfaxes had not been on the Richmond guest list for 3 years. "Who is it from?" "Beer," Clara asked, coughing weakly from her armchair near the meager fire. "An error, I suspect," Brianna murmured, tracing the heavy, embossed gold crest. But it was addressed specifically to her, Miss Brianna Fairfax. Against her better judgment, and driven by the desperate hope that she might find a wealthy, oblivious gentleman to tolerate her and pay her father's debts, she attended. She wore the same altered lavender gown, feeling the threadbare nature of the silk acutely under the brilliant lighting of the Richmond ballroom. She immediately sought refuge in the shadows of a massive potted fern near the terrace doors, watching the whirling sea of brightly colored gowns and tailored regimentals. She planned to stay for exactly 1 hour, make polite conversation with anyone who accidentally bumped into her, and then slip away. "It is a remarkably poor hiding spot, Miss Fairfax. The fronds do not entirely conceal your hem." Brianna jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned to find the Duke of Ashbourne standing beside her. He was dressed impeccably in stark black evening wear, a stark contrast to the peacock colors of the other men. His imposing height cast a long shadow over her, and his stormy eyes were fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your Grace," she said, managing a shaky curtsy. "I was not hiding. I merely sought some air." "In a corner devoid of a breeze?" Ariston asked, a faint sardonic smile playing on his lips. "You are a terrible liar, Miss Fairfax. It is one of your few redeeming qualities." Brianna stiffened, her survival instincts flaring. She was unaccustomed to being noticed, let alone mocked by dukes. "I apologize if my presence offends you, Your Grace. I will take my leave." She stepped to pass him, but he smoothly shifted his weight, blocking her path. "I did not say I was offended. I said you were a terrible liar. There is a distinction." He extended a gloved hand toward her. "Dance with me." The command was so unexpected that Brianna actually let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Dance? With you? Your Grace, I believe you have mistaken me for someone else. Perhaps Lady Genevieve is wearing a similar shade of faded lavender." Ariston's eyes hardened slightly at the mention of Genevieve. "I do not make mistakes regarding who I ask to dance. Take my hand, Miss Fairfax, before the entire room notices us standing here and assumes we are arguing." Realizing that a scene with the Duke of Ashbourne would bring exactly the kind of attention she could ill afford, Brianna hesitantly placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm through the fabric of her glove. He led her onto the floor just as the orchestra struck up a waltz. The waltz was still considered scandalous by the older generation, an intimate dance that required close physical proximity. As Ariston placed his hand firmly on her waist and pulled her into the rhythm, a collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The invisible girl was dancing with the most coveted prize in England. "You are tense," Ariston noted, steering her effortlessly through the crowd. "Are you afraid of me, Miss Fairfax?" "I am afraid of the sudden target you have painted on my back, Your Grace," Brianna replied, her voice low and tight. She could feel the acidic glares of a dozen women boring into her, Lady Genevieve foremost among them. Genevieve's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Tomorrow, I will be the subject of every vicious rumor in Mayfair. Let them talk, Ariston said dismissively. Their opinions are as worthless as their pedigrees. Tell me instead why you steal bread from Lord Castlereagh's table. Brianna stumbled, losing the steps of the waltz. Ariston caught her smoothly, pulling her an inch closer to maintain their balance. Her face burned with intense humiliation. He had seen. I do not know what you are speaking of, she stammered, looking away. We have already established that you are a poor liar, Ariston reminded her gently, though his eyes remained sharp. You were stealing food. And your dress, while beautifully altered, is heavily worn. Your father has bankrupted you, hasn't he? My family's finances are none of your concern. Your Grace, Brianna snapped, a spark of genuine anger finally breaking through her fearful facade. She met his gaze directly, her brown eyes flashing. You may enjoy playing games with the poor and ruined for your own amusement, but I will not be your court jester. Please let me go. Ariston looked at the fierce pride in her face, completely unmasked and raw. He was surrounded by sycophants who would sell their own souls for a fraction of his wealth, yet this ruined baron's daughter was demanding to be released from his arms. I am not playing a game, Brianna, he said, using her Christian name for the first time. The intimacy of it sent a shiver down her spine. The music swelled to a close, but he did not release her waist immediately. I am simply gathering information. I suggest you decide whether you want to remain a ghost, or if you want to survive. He finally stepped back, offered a perfectly executed, formal bow, and turned away, leaving Brianna standing in the center of the floor, feeling more exposed and terrified than she ever had in her life. The repercussions of the waltz were immediate and severe. By Tuesday, tradesmen who had previously extended the Fairfaxes a modicum of credit abruptly demanded immediate payment. The baker refused to hand over their meager daily loaf. The apothecary demanded coin before dispensing the camphor Clara desperately needed. Brianna realized with a sinking horror that Lady Genevieve Rutherford had been busy. Genevieve had vast social influence, and she was wielding it like a scythe to punish the woman who had dared to dance with her intended prize. By drawing Ariston's attention, Brianna had inadvertently triggered the final collapse of her family's precarious existence. On Thursday night, the situation escalated from desperate to lethal. A heavy, violent pounding on the front door shattered the silence of the Bloomsbury house. Brianna's father was not home. Clara whimpered from her bed. Brianna grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker and crept toward the foyer. Before she could reach the latch, the door was kicked open, splintering the aged wood. 3 men stepped into the dim hallway. At the center stood Silas Rutledge. He was a broad, thickly built man with a pockmarked face and a smile that resembled an open wound. Good evening, Miss Fairfax, Rutledge purred, removing his rain-soaked hat. I apologize for the late hour, but your father seems to have misplaced my invitation to call. He also seems to have misplaced my £3,000. The month is not over, Mr. Rutledge, Brianna said, her voice shaking despite her desperate grip on the iron poker. You gave him until the 30th. Circumstances have changed, Rutledge said, stepping closer. The smell of stale gin and wet wool rolled off him. I hear you've been dancing with dukes, making a spectacle of yourself. A woman with those kinds of connections shouldn't be letting her father default on his debts. But since the money isn't here, he looked her up and down, his gaze violating. I think it's time we renegotiated the collateral. You'll come with me. We'll find a way for you to work off the debt. I run a very profitable establishment near Covent Garden. I will not go anywhere with you, Brianna said, raising the poker. Get out of my house. Rutledge laughed. He gestured to the 2 thugs beside him. Take her, and if the sick sister makes a noise, silence her. The thugs lunged. Brianna swung the poker, striking one man a glancing blow on the shoulder, but the other grabbed her from behind, wrenching her arms back. She screamed, struggling wildly as the iron clattered to the floor. Rutledge stepped forward, raising a heavy, calloused hand to strike her across the face. The blow never landed. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the street into the doorway. A walking stick with a heavy silver wolf's head handle lashed out with terrifying speed, striking Rutledge squarely in the jaw. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the loan shark collapsed to the floor, unconscious before he hit the floorboards. The 2 thugs froze, dropping Brianna in shock. Standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 large men in the plain clothes of Bow Street runners, was Ariston Street John. He was not dressed for a ball. He wore a heavy riding coat, his cravat loose, and his eyes burned with a cold, murderous fury. He stepped into the hallway, casually stepping over Rutledge's bleeding form. He looked at the 2 thugs. If either of you is still in this house in exactly 3 seconds, my men will shoot you where you stand. The thugs did not need a second warning. They scrambled backward, pushing past the Duke and fleeing into the rainy night. Brianna fell against the wall, gasping for air, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She stared at Ariston, unable to comprehend how he had arrived at this exact, desperate moment. How, she managed to choke out. Ariston signaled for his men to drag Rutledge out into the street. Once the hallway was clear, he turned his full attention to Brianna. His expression softened infinitesimally as he took in her bruised arms and terrified face. "I told you I was gathering information," Ariston said quietly, stepping closer. "I have men whose sole occupation is to know the things others try to hide. I knew about your father's debt. I knew about Rutledge. I was waiting to see how far your father would let it go before he sold you to save himself. It appears I had my answer tonight." Brianna wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only exhaustion and despair. "So you saved me. Thank you, Your Grace. But it changes nothing. Rutledge will return, or others like him. We are ruined. Rutledge will not return," Ariston stated with absolute certainty. "He will be boarding a ship bound for the penal colonies in Australia by morning. I have ensured it." Brianna looked up at him, bewildered. "Why? Why are you doing this? I am nothing to you." "Because, Miss Fairfax, you are the only woman I have met in 10 years who did not want me," Ariston said, a dry, self-deprecating note in his voice. "Because you fight with fireplace pokers instead of tears. And because I find myself entirely unwilling to let you be destroyed by this wretched society." He reached into his heavy coat and withdrew a folded sheaf of papers. He held them out to her. "What is this?" she asked, not taking them. "It is a special license, procured from the Archbishop of Canterbury this very afternoon," Ariston said steadily. "And a financial contract. It settles all of your father's debts, entirely severs his legal authority over you, and establishes a massive, untouchable trust for the medical care and comfortable housing of your sister, Clara." Brianna stared at the papers, her mind reeling. "A special license? For what?" "For our marriage," Ariston said. He did not drop to one knee. He did not speak of love or poetic devotion. He stood straight, offering a pragmatic, ironclad lifeline. "I require a duchess to silence the relentless hounding of the Tun and to secure my succession. You require protection, money, and power to save your sister. We will be married in 3 weeks' time. You will never be invisible, hungry, or afraid again. Do we have an agreement, Brianna?" She looked from the papers to the impossibly proud, complex man standing in her ruined hallway. The offer was absurd. It was scandalous. It was entirely devoid of romance. But as she heard Clara cough weakly from the back room, Brianna reached out and took the papers. 3 weeks, she whispered. 3 weeks, the Duke agreed. And for the first time since she had shattered the glass at the banquet, Ariston Street John truly smiled. Morning arrived with a brutal, biting frost that coated the cobblestones of Bloomsbury, but inside the crumbling Fairfax residence, a frantic, highly organized evacuation was underway. Ariston Street. John had not merely made a proposal. He had executed a military maneuver. By 8 o'clock, 3 unmarked but immaculately sprung carriages sat waiting outside. Within them were thick sable lap robes, copper foot warmers, and a prominent physician named Dr. Matthew Bailey, whom Ariston had summoned directly from his royal appointments at Carlton House to attend to Clara. Brianna stood in the center of her stripped bedchamber, clutching a single battered portmanteau containing her mother's letters and a few worn ribbons. Everything else, the frayed gowns, the mended stockings, the physical manifestations of her poverty, Ariston had ordered burned. Her father, Thomas Fairfax, had finally returned from his nocturnal debaucheries, stumbling into the foyer only to be intercepted by Ariston's solicitor, a ruthless man named Mr. Sterling. Through the thin walls, Brianna heard the cold, metallic clink of a heavy coin purse hitting the table, followed by the rustle of legal parchment. Thomas was legally barred from coming within 50 miles of Brianna or Clara, his debts paid in exchange for his permanent exile to a modest cottage in Yorkshire. He had signed the papers without a single protest, taking the money and leaving before Brianna even had the chance to say goodbye. The realization stung, a sharp ache of abandonment, but it was quickly eclipsed by the overwhelming reality of her new circumstances. "He is gone," Ariston said, appearing in the doorway. He wore a tailored coat of dark navy wool, his demeanor as composed and unreadable as ever. "Your sister is settled in the second carriage with Dr. Bailey. It is time we departed." "Brianna, where are we going?" she asked, her voice tight. The speed of her life's unraveling and reweaving was making her dizzy. "To Ashbourne House, my primary residence in Mayfair," he replied smoothly, taking the portmanteau from her unresisting fingers. "My widowed aunt, Lady Augusta, has agreed to act as your chaperone and sponsor for the next 3 weeks. She is entirely deaf in her left ear and possesses a terrifyingly sharp tongue, but she is fiercely loyal. The journey to Grosvenor Square was a masterclass in silent tension. As they entered the sprawling, limestone-fronted mansion, Brianna felt the sheer, crushing weight of Ariston's wealth. Ashbourne House was a labyrinth of gilded moulding, imported Italian marble, and liveried footmen who bowed with synchronized precision. Her installation in the East Wing did not go unnoticed by the vicious machinery of the ton. By nightfall, the gossip had ignited like dry kindling. The Duke of Ashbourne had taken in the ruined Fairfax girl. The publication of their wedding banns the following Sunday in St. George's, Hanover Square, caused two wealthy dowagers to visibly swoon during the sermon. Lady Genevieve Rutherford received the news while taking her morning chocolate. She shattered her favorite Severus cup against the marble fireplace of her drawing room. Genevieve had invested 3 years into cultivating the perfect, demure facade to trap the Duke. She was the daughter of an earl. She possessed a dowry of £40,000. To be usurped by a penniless, invisible mouse who stole bread at dinner was an insult that demanded immediate, absolute destruction. Genevieve immediately dispatched her lady's maid with a flurry of notes to her most sycophantic allies. If Ariston intended to force this wretched creature down the throat of high society, Genevieve would ensure Brianna choked on the ordeal. She began by targeting the weakest link, Clara. Whispers began to snake through the exclusive drawing rooms of Mayfair. It was not a simple chest cold that afflicted the younger Fairfax sister, the rumors claimed. It was consumption, a deadly, highly contagious strain of tuberculosis. Lady Genevieve loudly declared at a luncheon hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire that by bringing the Fairfax girls into his home, Ariston was endangering the entire aristocracy. The implication was clear. Brianna was unclean, a carrier of disease and misfortune. When the rumor inevitably reached Ashbourne House, brought in by a sympathetic but panicked seamstress, Brianna felt her carefully constructed composure crack. She found Ariston in his sprawling library, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers. "They are saying Clara is a plague," Brianna said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "They are saying I am unfit to be in civilized company. This is Genevieve's doing. I know it." Ariston looked up from his desk, his expression darkening into a thunderous scowl. He carefully placed his quill down. "Doctor, Bailey has assured me Clara's affliction is asthma, exacerbated by the damp and cold of your previous living conditions. It is not contagious." "The ton does not care about Dr. Bailey's medical opinion," Brianna cried out, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "They care about the scandal. They will isolate you, Ariston. They will refuse to attend the wedding. You are tying yourself to a pariah." Ariston stood, walking around the massive oak desk until he was standing mere inches from her. He reached out, his long fingers gently grasping her chin, forcing her to look up into his storm-grey eyes. "Let them refuse," he said softly, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, quiet authority. "I do not require their attendance, Brianna. I require yours. And as for Lady Genevieve and her venomous circle, I will show them exactly what happens when they attempt to dictate the affairs of the Duke of Ashbourne." Preparations for the wedding escalated into an elaborate, high-stakes campaign. Ariston treated Brianna's integration into his world not as a social obligation, but as a strategic war. He hired Madame Celeste, the most fiercely exclusive modiste in London, a woman who famously made the Prince Regent wait 3 months for a fitting. Madame Celeste arrived at Ashbourne House with 6 assistants and trunks full of Lyon silk, Belgian lace, and shimmering Indian muslins. For a week, Brianna was pinned, measured, and draped until her muscles ached. The faded lavender gowns were replaced by wardrobes of walking dresses in deep emerald greens, evening gowns of midnight blue that brought out the unexpected gold flecks in her brown eyes, and riding habits of stark, unforgiving black tailored to perfection. Lady Augusta, Ariston's formidable aunt, took charge of Brianna's social re-education. Armed with a silver-tipped cane that she frequently used to punctuate her sentences, Augusta drilled Brianna on the complex genealogies of the peerage, the subtle art of the cutting snub, and how to wield a painted silk fan with lethal precision. "You are not a victim anymore, my girl," Augusta barked one afternoon, striking the floor with her cane as Brianna practiced her curtsy. "You are about to be a duchess. If someone looks at you with pity, you freeze them with disdain. If they whisper behind your back, you turn around and stare at them until they wither. You must be untouchable." Despite the rigorous training, the true shift occurred between Brianna and Ariston. The cold, transactional nature of their midnight bargain began to thaw in the quiet moments between the chaos. Late in the evenings, when the house finally slept, Brianna would often find Ariston in the library. He never turned her away. They began to talk, trading sharp observations and dry wit. Brianna discovered that Ariston's cynicism was born of a deep betrayal. 5 years prior, he had been engaged to a woman named Sophia, a fragile, beautiful aristocrat. Sophia had broken the engagement merely days before the wedding, eloping with Ariston's closest friend and running away to the continent, taking a substantial portion of Ashbourne family jewels with her. The humiliation had calcified Ariston's heart, convincing him that all society women were inherently deceitful, motivated only by greed and self-preservation. "You, however," Ariston murmured one night, pouring them both a small glass of expensive French brandy, "are remarkably transparent in your desperation." "It is refreshing. I am not desperate anymore," Brianna replied, taking the glass, her fingers brushing against his. A spark of electricity shot up her arm, settling warmly in her chest. "I am merely determined." Their newfound alliance was brutally tested exactly 10 days before the wedding. Ariston insisted they attend the weekly promenade in Hyde Park. It was a blatant display of defiance, a direct challenge to the rumors Genevieve had sown. Ariston drove his open-top phaeton himself, the matching black Andalusian horses stepping perfectly in sync. Brianna sat beside him, wearing a pelisse of rich burgundy velvet, her chin held high, terrified but resolute. As they entered the park, the effect was immediate. Carriages slowed. Pedestrians stopped and stared. The invisible girl was now seated beside the sun around which London society orbited. Near the Serpentine River, they encountered an intricate knot of carriages belonging to Lady Genevieve and her entourage. Genevieve, seated in an elegant landau, spotted them and commanded her driver to block the path. Ariston pulled back on the reins, his horses tossing their heads impatiently. "Your Grace," Genevieve called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She did not even glance at Brianna. "We are all so terribly worried for your health, to be exposing yourself to contaminated company." She raised a perfumed lace handkerchief to her nose, an exaggerated gesture of disgust. A cruel titter ran through Genevieve's companions. Brianna felt the blood drain from her face. Her training with Lady Augusta screamed at her to remain impassive, but the public humiliation was a physical blow. She braced herself for Ariston to smoothly navigate around the insult, to maintain his aristocratic detachment. Instead, Ariston stood up in his carriage, tossing the heavy leather reins to his groom. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute silence that had fallen over the crowd ensured his words carried to every ear. "Lady Genevieve," Ariston said, his tone striking like a physical blow, "I find your concern touching, if entirely misplaced. The only contamination in this park today stems from the foul, baseless lies spilling from your mouth." Genevieve gasped, her pale cheeks flushing an ugly, mottled red. "Ariston, you cannot speak to me. I am the Duke of Ashbourne, and I will speak to you exactly as your behavior warrants," Ariston interrupted seamlessly. He turned slightly, offering his hand to Brianna. "Miss Fairfax is under my protection. Next week, she will be my wife. Anyone, be they an earl's daughter or a street sweeper who speaks her name with anything less than absolute respect, will find themselves entirely erased from polite society. I will personally ruin any family that dares to slight my duchess." He sat back down, taking the reins. "Move your carriage, Genevieve, before I instruct my horses to walk straight through it." Humiliated, shaking with rage and public defeat, Genevieve signaled her driver. The carriage hastily pulled aside. As Ariston drove the phaeton forward, scattering the gawking onlookers, Brianna sat in stunned silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but it was no longer from fear. She looked at the sharp, unforgiving profile of the man beside her. He had not just protected her, he had claimed her. "You did not have to do that," she said softly, once they were clear of the crowd. Ariston did not look away from the road, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "I protect what is mine, Brianna, and it is entirely time this city learned that you are no longer invisible." 4 days before the wedding, the simmering Cold War between Ashbourne House and the vindictive factions of the Ton reached its boiling point. Lady Genevieve Rutherford, having failed to break Ariston's resolve in Hyde Park, shifted her strategy to a far more dangerous arena: Almack's assembly rooms. Almack's was the undisputed holy of holies for London high society. Entry was governed by a ruthless cabal of patronesses, among them the terrifyingly snobbish Sarah Villiers, Countess of Jersey, and the politically lethal Russian ambassador's wife, Princess Dorothea Lieven. To be denied a voucher to Wednesday night's assembly was social execution. It meant one was officially unacceptable. On Tuesday afternoon, a crisp white envelope arrived for Ariston, but notably absent was the accompanying voucher for Brianna. Genevieve had called in every favor, leveraged her family's political weight, and successfully persuaded Princess Leven that admitting the daughter of a ruined, exiled baron would fatally lower the tone of the establishment. When Lady Augusta discovered the omission, she struck her cane against the marble floor so hard the vibration rattled the window panes. "It is an open declaration of war. Ariston," Augusta warned, her eyes flashing. "If Brianna does not attend tomorrow night, the Tun will take it as proof that even you cannot force them to swallow her presence. Your marriage will be permanently tainted." Ariston stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. His jaw was locked in rigid, furious lines. They overplay their hand. Leven forgets that her husband's diplomatic standing heavily relies on the financial backing of English peers. "Peers like myself. You cannot buy a voucher to Almack's, Ariston," Augusta pointed out grimly. "No," Ariston agreed, turning to face Brianna, who was seated silently on the velvet settee, a knot of pure anxiety tightening in her stomach. "But I can buy the building. Or, failing that, I can apply leverage to the one man Princess Leven must bow to." Wednesday evening arrived with a suffocating tension. Madame Celeste had delivered Brianna's gown for the occasion, a breathtaking creation of silver tissue over deep sapphire silk, designed to make her look less like a debutante and more like a young queen. As Ariston handed her into the carriage, he noticed the slight tremor in her gloved hands. "You are shaking," he observed quietly, taking her hand and chafing it gently between his own. "I am about to be publicly turned away from the most exclusive door in Europe," Brianna whispered, staring out the window at the gas lamps flickering in the London fog. "Lady Genevieve will be waiting in the foyer just to watch it happen." "Ariston, perhaps we should simply stay away. Why must we force them to accept me? Because if we retreat tonight, they will hunt you for the rest of our lives," Ariston replied, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "You are not a Fairfax facing debtors tonight, Brianna. You are my chosen duchess. Lift your chin." When their carriage pulled up to the unassuming brick facade of Almack's on King Street, the street was already congested with the elite. As Ariston and Brianna stepped out, whispers erupted like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. In the cramped foyer, guarded by the famously incorruptible Tiketika, Mr. Willis, stood Lady Genevieve. She was flanked by her sycophants, a triumphant, malicious smile plastered across her beautiful face. Above them, on the landing, stood Princess Leven, her gaze as cold as a Siberian winter. Ariston approached the desk, offering his own voucher. Mr. Willis bowed deeply. "Your Grace, it is an honor, but I see no voucher for your companion. Miss Fairfax is my betrothed. She enters with me," Ariston stated, his voice ringing clearly through the suddenly silent foyer. "I am terribly sorry, Your Grace." Princess Leven called down from the landing, her accent thick and unapologetic. "But the rules of Almack's are absolute. Vouchers are strictly required. We cannot make exceptions, even for dukes. It sets a dangerous precedent regarding pedigree." Genevieve's smile widened into a smirk. The humiliation was perfectly executed. Brianna felt her face burn, the instinct to turn and flee almost overwhelming. She looked at Ariston, expecting him to shout, to threaten, to cause a scene. Instead, Ariston pulled a heavy gold pocket watch from his waistcoat, checked the time, and snapped it shut. Right on schedule. Outside, the heavy clatter of a royal escort shattered the quiet of King Street. The doors to Almack's were abruptly thrown wide open by two towering guardsmen in the unmistakable scarlet and gold livery of the crown. The crowd in the foyer parted instantly, gasping in collective shock. Stepping into the vestibule, smelling faintly of expensive snuff and cherry brandy, was George, the Prince Regent. The acting monarch of the British Empire rarely attended Almack's, finding it stuffy. But tonight, he had arrived with an imposing entourage. Ariston had not bought a voucher. He had called in a staggering multi-million-pound debt the Crown owed the Ashbourne estate, exchanging financial leniency for a single, devastating social favor. The Prince Regent's eyes swept the room, ignoring the bowing aristocrats, until they landed on Ariston. "Ah, Ashbourne. There you are, you demanding scoundrel," the prince boomed jovially. He then turned his heavily powdered face toward Brianna. "And this must be the extraordinary Miss Fairfax. Ariston told me you possess a wit sharp enough to cut glass." Brianna, recovering her composure with a desperate surge of adrenaline, sank into a flawless, impossibly deep curtsy. "His Royal Highness is too kind to repeat His Grace's exaggerations." The Prince Regent chuckled, a wheezing sound, and offered Brianna his heavily ringed hand. "Nonsense. I am an excellent judge of character." He turned his massive bulk toward the stairs, fixing Princess Leven with a stern, authoritative glare. "Madam Leven, I trust there is no objection if I personally escort my dear friend's bride into the assembly. I left my voucher in my other coat." Princess Leven turned the color of chalk, To deny the Prince Regent was treason. To deny the woman on his arm was social suicide. She curtsied so hastily she nearly tripped. "It is our profound honor, Your Royal Highness." Lady Genevieve's smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She shrank back against the wall as the Prince Regent, with Brianna on his arm and Ariston walking at her other side like a lethal, triumphant shadow, ascended the stairs. In a single, orchestrated maneuver, Ariston had not merely secured Brianna's entry into society. He had positioned her at its absolute, unassailable apex. As they stepped onto the dance floor, the orchestra hurriedly struck up a tune, and Ariston smoothly took Brianna from the prince. "You," Brianna breathed, her heart hammering as Ariston pulled her into a waltz, "are a deeply terrifying man." "Only to my enemies," Ariston replied, a genuine, striking smile finally reaching his storm-grey eyes. "To you, Brianna, I am merely your husband." The wedding at St. George's, Hanover Square, was less a religious sacrament and more a coronation. The pews were packed to bursting with the most powerful figures in England, all clamoring to witness the union of the untouchable Duke and the invisible girl who had miraculously conquered him. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles Manners Sutton, officiated the ceremony with grave dignity. Brianna stood before the altar in a gown of heavy, ivory silk, the Brussels lace veil completely obscuring the lingering shadows of her past poverty. When Ariston slid the heavy gold band, embedded with a single, flawless sapphire, onto her finger, his gaze was intensely focused, anchoring her amidst the overwhelming spectacle. "I, Ariston, take thee, Brianna." His voice was steady, lacking the bored drawl he usually employed to keep the world at a distance. For the first time, Brianna allowed herself to believe that this was not merely a transaction for him either. The vows felt heavy, real, and permanently binding. The reception that followed at Ashbourne House was a dizzying blur of champagne, rich foods, and forced congratulations from people who, a month ago, would have gladly let Brianna starve in the streets. She navigated the treacherous waters of the ballroom with a newfound steely grace, leaning on the quiet, immovable strength of the man constantly at her side. But the past, Brianna was quickly learning, rarely stayed buried. It happened midway through the evening, while Ariston was briefly pulled away into his study by Lord Castlereagh to discuss a pressing matter in the House of Lords. Brianna was standing near the towering, tiered wedding cake, chatting amiably with the sympathetic Duchess of Devonshire, when a commotion erupted near the gallery doors. A woman, dishevelled and frantic, was struggling against the restraint of two liveried footmen. She wore a travelling cloak that was once expensive but was now stained with mud and travel dust. Her blonde hair hung in lank strands around a remarkably beautiful, albeit haggard face. "Let me go. I must see him. I must see Ariston," the woman shrieked, her voice echoing over the polite chatter of the room. The music abruptly halted. Brianna excused herself from the Duchess and moved swiftly toward the gallery, her pulse quickening. She signaled the footman to pause but not release the intruder. "Who are you, and why are you causing a disruption in my home?" Brianna asked, her voice calm, projecting the cold authority Lady Augusta had drilled into her. The blonde woman looked at Brianna's ivory gown and the heavy sapphire on her finger. A look of profound despair crossed her features. "You are the new bride. The charity case." She let out a broken, hysterical laugh. "I am Sophia Cavendish, and I need to speak to the Duke. He will want to see me." A chilling silence fell over the immediate vicinity. The eavesdropping guests held their breath. Sophia, the woman who had shattered Ariston's trust, eloped with his closest friend, Lord Richard Stanhope, and stolen the Ashbourne diamonds. The architect of Ariston's cynicism had returned on the very day he attempted to move past it. "The Duke is occupied." "Mrs. Stanhope," Brianna said smoothly, intentionally, using the surname of the man Sophia had run away with. "Whatever business you have can be directed to his solicitor on Monday. Richard abandoned me in Paris." Sophia wept, her facade crumbling into genuine, pathetic desperation. "He gambled away the jewels. He left me with nothing. I had to sell my clothes to buy passage back to Dover. I have nowhere to go. Ariston loved me once. He must help me." At that moment, the heavy oak doors of the study opened, and Ariston stepped out, drawn by the sudden silence in the ballroom. He froze. The colour drained entirely from his face as he looked across the room and saw the ghost of his past standing before his new wife. Brianna saw the raw, unguarded shock in Ariston's eyes. She saw the sudden, agonizing vulnerability of the man who had spent the last 3 weeks relentlessly shielding her from the world. In that fractured second, Brianna made a choice. She would not be the insecure, frightened girl anymore. Ariston had waged war against London to protect her. She would now protect him from the one person capable of reopening his deepest wounds. Brianna stepped directly into Ariston's line of sight, physically blocking his view of Sophia. She turned her back to her husband and faced the ruined woman. "You mistake my husband's past affection for present obligation, Mrs. Stanhope," Brianna said. Her voice dropping to a low, lethal register meant only for Sophia and the immediate bystanders. "You made a choice 5 years ago. You chose theft and betrayal. You do not get to return when the consequences of your own treacherous actions become inconvenient." "You don't understand," Sophia sobbed, reaching out. "I understand perfectly," Brianna interrupted, her tone sharp as a razor. "I understand what it means to be ruined. But unlike you, I did not betray the people who cared for me to survive. You will not disrupt his peace. You will not inflict your guilt upon this house," Brianna signaled to her head footman. "Mr. Harrison, escort Mrs. Stanhope to the Mews. Have my personal carriage prepped. Give her £50 from the household ledger, enough to secure a modest room in a quiet village far from London, and instruct the driver to take her wherever she wishes to go, provided it is at least 100 miles from Mayfair." "No, Ariston," Sophia screamed, trying to look past Brianna. Brianna did not yield an inch. She stared Sophia down with the terrifying, unblinking intensity of a woman who had fought off loan sharks with an iron poker. "If you ever approach my husband again, Sophia, I promise you, the social ruin you face now will feel like a gentle rain compared to the storm I will bring down upon you. Take the money and leave." Now, defeated by the absolute, unyielding wall of the new Duchess, Sophia collapsed in upon herself, allowing the footman to lead her away through the side exit. The crisis averted, Brianna took a slow, deep breath. Smoothing the she turned around to face Ariston. He was standing exactly where he had frozen, but the shock had faded from his eyes. It was replaced by a look of profound, staggering awe. He had expected to have to harden his heart to deal with the agonizing mess of Sophia's return. Instead, his quiet, invisible bride had stepped in front of him like a vanguard, shielding him from the wreckage of his own history. Ariston crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, ignoring the hundreds of staring guests. He reached out, his large hands gently framing her face. "You dispatched her," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. "She was trespassing," Brianna replied simply, looking up into his stormy eyes, seeing the dark clouds finally beginning to break. "And I protect what is mine, Ariston." Autumn settled over London, turning the trees of Hyde Park a brilliant, fiery copper. 2 months had passed since the wedding at St. George's, and the scandalous marriage of the Duke of Ashbourne had transformed from a subject of outrage into an established, undeniable fact. Brianna had proven herself a formidable duchess, navigating the treacherous social currents with a quiet, lethal grace that even Lady Augusta applauded. Clara, relocated to the crisp, clean air of the Ashbourne country estate in Hampshire under the meticulous care of Dr. Matthew Bailey, was thriving. The frantic desperation that had once defined Brianna's existence was entirely gone, replaced by the heavy, comforting security of Ariston's protection. However, the shadows of the past were not so easily banished by wealth and title. The twist in their carefully orchestrated lives came not from high society, but from the gutter. It began on a foggy Tuesday morning. Brianna was in the morning room of Ashbourne House, reviewing the household ledgers, when Ariston's lead Bow Street runner, a scarred man named Mr. Higgins, barged past the protests of the butler. Higgins looked grave, twisting his wool cap in his hands. "Your Grace," Higgins said, bowing stiffly to Brianna just as Ariston strode into the room, alerted by the commotion. "I bring terrible news from Hampshire. It concerns your sister." Brianna dropped her quill, her blood turning to ice. "Clara, is she ill? Has the asthma returned?" "No, Your Grace," Higgins replied heavily. "She has been taken, snatched right from the estate gardens during her morning walk. The governess was knocked unconscious. We found this pinned to the garden gate." He handed a crumpled, dirty piece of parchment to Ariston. Ariston's storm-grey eyes scanned the words, his jaw clenching so tightly a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He handed the note to Brianna. "The Duke took my daughter, so I've taken his ward. £50,000 in unmarked Bank of England notes, brought to the abandoned sugar warehouse at Wapping Docks by midnight. Come alone, or the sickly girl goes into the Thames." It was signed with a clumsy, familiar scrawl. "Thomas Fairfax." "My father," Brianna whispered, the parchment trembling in her hands. "But he was exiled." He signed the papers. Mr. Sterling ensured he was banished to Yorkshire. "He did not act alone," Ariston stated, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He turned to Higgins. "Fairfax does not have the intelligence or the resources to bypass my estate security in Hampshire. Who is backing him? We did some digging in the taverns near the docks. "Your Grace," Higgins reported. Lord Richard Stanhope returned from Paris 3 weeks ago, heavily in debt to French gambling syndicates. He was seen drinking with Thomas Fairfax at a pub in Southwark 2 nights ago. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. Sophia Cavendish's return had been a distraction, a pathetic symptom of a larger disease. Richard Stanhope, having exhausted Sophia's stolen jewels, had returned to London desperate for capital. Knowing Ariston would never give him a shilling, he had sought out the one man who held a grievance against the Duke Brianna's disgraced father. Together, they had orchestrated a ransom plot to extort the Ashbourne fortune. Panic, raw and suffocating, threatened to drag Brianna under. But as she looked at Ariston, she saw not fear, but a cold, calculated state of absolute war. "Gather every runner on the payroll," Ariston commanded Higgins, grabbing his heavy riding coat from a nearby chair. "Arm them. Have the carriages prepped immediately." "Ariston," Brianna said, standing up, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. The note said to come alone. "If they see a dozen Bow Street runners, my father will panic. He is a coward, but Stanhope is desperate. They might hurt her. I am not leaving you here, and I am not letting them dictate the terms of this engagement," Ariston replied, strapping a heavy, silver-handled pistol into the holster at his waist. "I am not asking to stay," Brianna said, stepping forward, her eyes locking with his. "I am going with you. I know my father. I know how to manipulate his greed, and I know the layout of the Wapping docks. I used to buy cheap coal there when we were starving in Bloomsbury." Ariston looked at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. He saw the fierce, unyielding determination of the woman who had fought off loan sharks with a fireplace poker. He nodded once. "Get your cloak." The carriage ride to Wapping was conducted in absolute, tense silence. The thick London fog rolled off the River Thames, carrying the stench of rotting fish and damp wood. As they approached the labyrinth of dark, towering warehouses, Ariston ordered the carriage to halt 2 streets away. Higgins and his men dispersed into the shadows, creating an invisible perimeter. Ariston and Brianna walked the remaining distance together. The sugar warehouse loomed in the mist, its windows shattered. The massive wooden loading doors chained shut from the inside. A single, flickering lantern illuminated a small side entrance. "Stay behind me," Ariston murmured, pushing the side door open. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sweet, decaying smell of old molasses. In the center of the cavernous space, illuminated by a circle of oil lamps, stood Thomas Fairfax. He looked haggard, his clothes filthy, gripping a rusted hunting knife. Behind him, tied to a wooden chair, was Clara. She was pale and coughing, but alive. Standing in the shadows to the left, leaning casually against a support beam, was Lord Richard Stanhope. He wore a tailored coat that was frayed at the cuffs, a stark contrast to his aristocratic sneer. "You brought the bitch with you," Thomas spat, seeing Brianna step into the light beside Ariston. The note said, "Come alone, Ashbourne." "And yet, I rarely do as I am told by bankrupt drunkards," Ariston replied, his voice echoing coldly off the brick walls. His hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol. "Where is the money?" Stanhope demanded, stepping forward, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. 50,000. "Ariston, it is a pittance to you. Pay it, and you can have the little consumptive wretch back." "You will not see a single penny, Richard," Ariston stated, his voice laced with absolute disdain. "You stole from my estate 5 years ago. Did you truly believe I would allow you to do it a second time?" "I am her father," Thomas roared, pointing the knife at Brianna. "She owes me. I raised her. I own her." Before Ariston could draw his weapon, Brianna stepped out from behind him. She did not cower. She did not weep. She walked forward until she was mere feet from the tip of her father's blade. "You own nothing," Brianna said, her voice ringing with the lethal authority of a duchess. "You gambled away my mother's life. You starved us. You attempted to sell me to Silas Rutledge to pay for your gin. I am not your daughter anymore, Thomas. I am the Duchess of Ashbourne, and you are a trespasser attempting to extort the Crown's favoured peer." Thomas faltered, shocked by the sheer, imposing presence of the woman he had always treated as invisible furniture. "If you harm one hair on Clara's head," Brianna continued, her eyes burning with a dark, terrifying fire, "my husband will not simply kill you. He will ensure your name is erased from the earth. Drop the knife." Stanhope panicked. Seeing Thomas waver, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small flintlock pistol, aiming it directly at Brianna's chest. "Shut up, both of you. Give me the money or I will shoot her where she stands." The crack of a gunshot deafened the warehouse, but it did not come from Stanhope's pistol. Ariston had drawn his weapon with blinding speed. The silver-handled pistol smoked in his hand. Stanhope screamed, dropping his weapon as a bullet shattered his shoulder. He collapsed to the filthy floor, writhing in agony. Thomas, terrified by the sudden violence, dropped his knife and fell to his knees, raising his hands in surrender. In seconds, Higgins and the Bow Street runners swarmed the warehouse, securing the perimeter and dragging Stanhope to his feet. Ariston did not even look at the bleeding aristocrat. He holstered his weapon and strode past Thomas, untying the thick ropes that bound Clara to the chair. Brianna rushed forward, catching her sister as Clara slumped forward, crying softly. "I have you, darling," Brianna whispered, burying her face in Clara's hair. "You are safe." Ariston turned to look at Thomas Fairfax, who was weeping pathetic tears of terror on the floorboards. "Mr. Higgins," Ariston said coldly, "book Lord Stanhope for kidnapping and extortion. As for Mr. Fairfax, ensure he is placed on the next prison hulk bound for Botany Bay. He has forfeited his right to walk on English soil." As the runners dragged the two men away into the fog, Ariston knelt beside Brianna and Clara. He took off his heavy riding coat and wrapped it securely around the shivering girl. Then, he looked at Brianna. The mask of the cold, untouchable Duke had completely vanished, leaving only the fierce, unguarded devotion of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "Let us go home," he said quietly, offering them both his hands. The scandalous arrest of Lord Richard Stanhope and the subsequent deportation of Thomas Fairfax dominated the gossip columns for exactly a week before Ariston ruthlessly suppressed the coverage. He utilized his immense political leverage to seal the court records, protecting Clara from the vicious scrutiny of the Ton. Lady Genevieve Rutherford, realizing the absolute, terrifying extent of Ashbourne's power and his devotion to his new wife, permanently retired to her family's estate in the country, effectively ending the social war. Winter fell over London, blanketing the city in a quiet, pristine white. Ashbourne House, once a cavernous monument to isolation and cynical detachment, was transformed. The halls were warm, fires blazed in every hearth, and Clara's recovering laughter frequently echoed from the music room. On Christmas Eve, a lavish private dinner was held. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling, hostile banquet at Lord Castlereagh's where Brianna and Ariston had first crossed paths. Tonight, there were no judgmental stares or whispers of ruin. Present were only Lady Augusta, Dr. Bailey, a few trusted allies, and Clara, who looked healthier and more vibrant than she ever had in her life. Brianna sat at the head of the table opposite Ariston. She wore a gown of rich crimson velvet, the Ashbourne diamonds glittering flawlessly at her throat. She caught Ariston's gaze across the candlelight. He raised his glass to her in a silent, private toast, the storm in his eyes replaced by a deep, steady warmth. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the house fell into a comfortable silence, Brianna found Ariston in the library. He was standing by the massive windows, watching the snow fall over the gardens of Grosvenor Square. She walked softly across the Persian rug, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind and resting her cheek against the solid expanse of his back. Ariston turned, enveloping her in his arms. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of jasmine in her hair. "You are quiet tonight," he observed softly. "I was merely reflecting," Brianna murmured, tracing the embroidered pattern on his waistcoat. "A year ago, I was stealing bread to survive. Tonight, I am dripping in diamonds, watching the snow fall from the most powerful house in Mayfair. It feels as though I am living someone else's life." "It is your life, Brianna," Ariston said, pulling back slightly to look down into her eyes. "You earned it. You fought for it. You fought for me, when I had entirely forgotten how to fight for myself." He reached out, his thumb gently brushing across her cheekbone. The transactional nature of their midnight bargain in Bloomsbury felt like a lifetime ago. The contract they had signed was a legal formality. The true bond had been forged in the fire of their shared battles, in the quiet moments of mutual protection, and in the profound, unspoken realization that they were perfectly, undeniably matched. "When I saw you at Castlereagh's dinner," Ariston confessed, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate whisper, "I thought you were merely a curiosity, a girl trying to disappear, but I was wrong. You were never invisible, Brianna. You were simply waiting for the right moment to step into the light. And when you did, you entirely blinded me." Brianna smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that illuminated the dark library. "You offered me a heavily armored fortress, Your Grace. I merely decided to decorate it." Ariston laughed, a rare, beautiful sound, and leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, passionate kiss. It was a vow far more binding than the one spoken in Street George's, a promise of absolute loyalty, enduring strength, and a love that had defied every mandate of a cynical world. The invisible girl had not just survived the vicious machinery of the Ton. She had conquered its most untouchable king, proving that the most formidable power a woman could wield was not a pristine pedigree, but an unbreakable, fiercely devoted heart. In the annals of British high society, the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne remained a legendary anomaly. Brianna never faded into the background again. She became a formidable political hostess, a ruthless protector of her family, and a generous patron to the impoverished corners of London she had once navigated to survive. Clara, completely cured of her ailments by the pristine country air and exceptional medical care, grew into a vibrant young woman, eventually marrying a respected earl under her sister's fiercely protective eye. Arriston Street, John, once the most cynical and unapproachable peer in the realm, found his absolute salvation in the woman he had married on a 3-week deadline. Their legacy was one of unshakable unity and profound devotion, a stark reminder to the glittering, predatory ton that true power is not inherited in a bloodline, but forged in the fire of mutual survival.